The sun blazed over the African savannah, casting long shadows across the golden grass. The air shimmered with heat, and a faint breeze carried the smell of dust and wildflowers. Birds circled lazily above, and far in the distance, a lion's roar broke the silence, deep, thunderous, and ancient. David stood beside his old jeep, his hand shading his eyes from the glare. The sound wasn't far away, maybe a few hundred meters. His camera hung from his neck, but his mind wasn't focused on pictures. He had come here to document the truth, the suffering of wild animals trapped between beauty and brutality. But this time, what he found would change everything. His local guide, Samuel, climbed down from the jeep. "We should head back," he said, nervously scanning the horizon. "Lions hunt at this hour. The sun is dying." David nodded absently but didn't move. His eyes had caught something, a flicker of movement in the grass. A lioness, limping badly, her golden fur was streaked with dust and blood. She looked thin, weak, desperate, and behind her, a cub, barely big enough to walk, stumbling after her tiny paws. David froze. The mother lion looked exhausted, not from hunting, but from running. She was hurt. "She's injured," David whispered. Samuel stiffened. "Then she's dangerous. Don't go near her. If she feels trapped, she'll kill you." But David wasn't listening. Something inside him stirred, a pull he couldn't explain. He'd seen suffering before, but there was something about this lioness's eyes. They weren't wild, they were pleading. He took a slow step forward. "David," Samuel warned, "you don't understand lions. You're walking to your death." But David only said softly, "If I walk away, she'll die." Samuel cursed under his breath. "You can't save them all." David moved anyway, one step at a time. The lioness saw him, froze, and let out a low growl that rumbled through the air like thunder. The cub hid behind her legs. David raised his hands slowly. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." The lioness limped backward, then stumbled. That's when David saw it, a steel snare clamped tightly around her front leg, biting deep into her flesh. His heart dropped. Poachers. The pain in her eyes made sense now. It wasn't hunger or rage, it was agony. "Samuel," he shouted, "she's caught in a trap." Samuel's voice cracked. "Then it's even worse. If you touch her, she'll attack. Get back here." David ignored him. He took another step. The lioness growled again, baring her teeth, but her strength was fading. He crouched, his voice low, calm. "It's okay. I'll help you." Her breathing quickened, her muscles tense. She was torn between fear and exhaustion. David knelt down slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for his bag. He pulled out a thick cloth, wrapping it around his arm. He wasn't sure what he was doing, just that he had to try. The lioness's tail flicked once, a warning. "Please," David whispered, "let me help." He reached for the snare. The metal was buried deep, rusty, slick with blood. It had been there for days. Every time she tried to move, it cut deeper. He tugged. The wire didn't budge. The lioness flinched, roaring weakly, her paw twitching. David froze. He could feel her breath on his face, hot, shallow, and full of pain. Then, with one desperate twist, the wire snapped loose. The lioness roared, leaping back, but not to attack. She stumbled, limped, then looked at him. For a moment, everything was silent. David stayed perfectly still. The cub peeked from behind her, its eyes wide. The lioness stared at him for a long second. Then, unbelievably, she took a step forward. Her head lowered, her eyes softened, and then she turned, guiding her cub away into the setting sun. David stayed kneeling in the dust, heart pounding. He didn't even realize tears were running down his cheeks. He had done it. He'd saved her. Samuel ran up behind him, panting. "You're out of your mind," he shouted. "You could have died." David just smiled faintly. Maybe, but she didn't. That night, back at camp, David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the lioness's face, her trust, her pain, but something gnawed at him. The wound was deep. Infection was possible. She needed help, real help. When dawn came, David made a decision. He packed supplies, food, water, medicine. Samuel tried to stop him. "You've done enough," he said. "If she's still out there, she'll kill you next time." David only said, "Then I'll die trying to make it right." Hours later, the jeep bounced across the plains. The sun was merciless. Sweat ran down his face, dust filled his lungs, but he didn't care. He searched for hours. Then, near a dry riverbed, he found her. The lioness lay on her side, breathing shallowly. Her cub was beside her, crying softly, nudging her face. David ran. He dropped to his knees beside her. Her leg was swollen, infected the wound dark and oozing. She opened her eyes, weakly lifting her head. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm here." He poured water on the wound, cleaned it gently. She flinched, but didn't move. She remembered him. He mixed an antibiotic and carefully injected it near the wound. Then he sat beside her, fanning her with his hat to keep flies away. The cub sat near him, watching closely. It wasn't afraid any more. For hours he stayed. The sky turned orange, then deep red. The lioness's breathing slowed. Her eyes fluttered. "Come on, girl," he murmured. "Stay with me." But she didn't. Her chest rose once more, and stopped. David froze. His hands shook as he pressed against her side. Nothing. The cub cried out, a small broken sound that pierced his heart. Tears blurred his vision. "No," he whispered, "not like this." He sat there for a long time, the world silent around him, as the life he'd tried to save slipped away. When the stars came out, he dug a shallow grave beneath an acacia tree. His hands bled, his body ached, but he didn't stop until she was covered. He placed a flat stone at her head and whispered, "I'm sorry. I was too late." The cub lay beside him, silent. He looked at it small, helpless, trembling. "It would never survive alone," David sighed. "Looks like it's just you and me now." He gently lifted the cub into his arms. It didn't resist. Its fur was soft, its tiny heart beating against his chest. He smiled through the tears. "Don't worry, little one. I'll take care of you." For weeks, David and the cub stayed together in a small, abandoned ranger hut. He named the cub Leo. At first, Leo was frightened, skittish, wild. But soon he began to follow David everywhere, tripping over his own paws, meowing softly when hungry. David fed him milk mixed with water, built him a small bed of blankets, and talked to him every night. "You're going to grow up strong, Leo," he'd whisper, "stronger than me." Leo would nuzzle against his arm, his eyes full of trust. They became inseparable. When David worked, Leo would sit nearby, watching. When he ate, Leo would beg for food, playful and curious. And sometimes, when the night was quiet, the cub would climb onto his lap and fall asleep to the rhythm of David's heartbeat. It was strange, a bond between man and beast. But somehow it felt natural. David began recording everything on his camera: the rescue, the cub, the story of survival. He wanted the world to see what love could do, but the wild doesn't let peace last forever. One evening, as the sun dipped low, David heard something: engines, distant but unmistakable. He stepped outside. 3 trucks were moving through the grassland, slow and deliberate. He raised his binoculars and his blood ran cold. Poachers. He could see rifles, traps, and men laughing. They were setting snares again. He whispered to himself, "Not again, not here." Leo, now larger and stronger, growled softly beside him. David crouched and pulled out his camera. "We're not letting them do this," he said quietly. He started filming, zooming in on the men. October 17th, he narrated softly, 3 vehicles near the western ridge, poachers setting traps. "If anything happens to me, please someone find this footage." He hid the memory card inside his boot just in case. Then, as he adjusted his camera, a twig snapped under his foot. The sound echoed. The men turned. There, one shouted. Gunfire erupted. David grabbed Leo and ran. Bullets tore through the air, shattering branches. "Go, Leo," he shouted. "Run." The cub hesitated, growling, refusing to leave. David ducked behind a rock, heart pounding. He could hear the men yelling, closing in. He needed to buy Leo time. He picked up a rock and threw it in the opposite direction. The noise drew the poachers' attention for a moment, but then one of them shouted, "Shoot the cub." David's heart stopped. He jumped out, waving his arms. No, don't shoot. A gun fired. Pain exploded in his shoulder. He fell. Leo roared louder than David had ever heard. The sound wasn't that of a cub anymore, it was the roar of a lion. He charged. The poachers screamed. Chaos erupted. The poachers shouted and fired wildly into the darkness. The sound of bullets tore through the air, echoing against the hills. David pressed his wounded shoulder, blood soaking through his shirt, but he didn't stop watching. Leo had leapt into the chaos like a storm. Though still young, his strength had blossomed. He crashed into one of the men, knocking him down. A gun flew into the dirt. The man screamed, rolling away, bleeding from his arm. Another poacher raised his rifle. David grabbed a stick and threw it, shouting, "Over here." The second man turned and fired. The bullet hit the rock beside David, showering him with dust. Leo roared again, a deep, guttural sound that made the night tremble. He stood between David and the men, his golden fur bristling, his teeth bared. The remaining poachers hesitated. "It's just one lion." One yelled, but his voice shook. David forced himself up, using the rock for support. "Leave," he shouted hoarsely. "Get out of here." The poachers cursed and ran for their trucks, firing a few last desperate shots before speeding away into the darkness. When the silence finally returned, the night felt impossibly still. David dropped to his knees, his vision blurred. "It's okay." He whispered, breathing hard. "They're gone." Leo walked to him, panting, his sides heaving. He nudged David's face gently, whining. David smiled weakly. "Good boy." He tried to lift his arm, but pain lanced through his shoulder. "You saved us." Leo licked his face, small and trembling again, the fury gone, replaced by fear. The stars wheeled above them, bright and cold. David looked up at them, the world spinning slightly. He knew he had to stop the bleeding, but his strength was fading fast. He reached for his bag and pulled out his emergency beacon. With his good hand, he pressed the button. A faint red light began to blink, an SOS that might reach the rangers miles away. He leaned back against the rock. "Now we just wait," he murmured. Leo lay beside him, curling close, his head resting on David's chest. The night was endless. Crickets sang. Somewhere far away, another lion roared, a deep, mournful sound that rolled across the plains. David smiled faintly. "Hear that? That's your family out there, Leo." The cub blinked up at him, his amber eyes catching the starlight. David closed his eyes for a moment. "You're going to be strong," he whispered. "Stronger than your mother, stronger than me." His breathing slowed, the pain dulled into warmth. He felt the cub's heartbeat against his ribs, fast and alive. "Don't ever be afraid," he said softly. "The world will fear you, but don't forget who you are." Leo whined quietly. David looked toward the east, where the first faint streak of dawn began to touch the sky. "Look at that! Sunrise already." He smiled, the corners of his mouth trembling. "We made it through the night, but the morning light kept coming, and David's body grew still. When the rangers found him 2 days later, they followed the blinking signal across the plains. They saw the overturned traps, the blood, the empty shell casings. Then they found David, slumped against the rock, his face peaceful. Beside him lay the small lion cub, silent, refusing to move. When the rangers tried to lift David's body, Leo growled softly, pressing closer as if guarding him. One ranger knelt and whispered, "It's all right, little one. We'll take you somewhere safe." Only then did Leo let them touch him. They carried David's body back to the reserve, along with his camera and his boots. Inside one boot, hidden under the sole, they found the small memory card. When the footage was played later, the world learned everything. The rescue, the snare, the cub, the chase, the sacrifice. It went viral within days. Millions watched, millions cried. News anchors called him the man who died for a lion. Wildlife groups raised funds in his name. A sanctuary was built where he had fallen, and they named it the David Harper Wildlife Reserve. As for Leo, the rangers brought him there. They nursed him, fed him, and watched him grow. The cub turned into a magnificent lion, strong, fierce, and proud. But no matter how big he grew, he never forgot. Every evening, as the sun sank and painted the world gold, Leo would walk to the fence, lie down beneath an old acacia tree, and stare toward the horizon. That was where they had buried David, beneath the same kind of tree where Leo's mother rested. The rangers often said it looked like Leo was waiting. Years passed. The reserve flourished. Tourists came from all over the world to see the lion who once lived with a man. They would ask the rangers, is it true he saved his mother? Is it true the man gave his life for him? And the guides would smile softly. Yes, they'd say, all of it is true. One evening, a young ranger was closing the gates when he heard a deep, thunderous roar echo across the plains. It came from Leo. The sound rolled through the sky, powerful and haunting. It wasn't a roar of anger, it was something else. A call, a memory, a goodbye. The ranger looked up and saw Leo standing on the hilltop, his mane glowing red in the sunset, his head raised toward the fading light. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Some said it was just instinct, but those who knew the story believed differently. They said Leo wasn't roaring into the wild. He was calling out to the man who once knelt in the dust and said, I've got you. And somehow, in the whispering wind that followed, they swore they heard a voice answer softly, I know. Epilogue: the footage David recorded was eventually turned into a documentary. It showed every detail: the rescue of the lioness, the cub's first steps, the confrontation with the poachers, the final moments of courage. It became one of the most watched wildlife films in history. Because it wasn't just a story about animals, it was a story about what it means to care when everyone else walks away. At the entrance of the David Harper Reserve stands a memorial stone.